Let's examine Chile, one of the nations you've studied. It had a thriving historic democracy and unexpectedly flipped into a dictatorship. You ask, could it happen in the U.S.? What did happen in Chile?
What did happen in Chile was the Latin American country with the longest history of democracy, century and a half, spiraling into a military dictatorship unforeseen by my Chilean friends. I moved to Chile in 1967, and my Chilean friends explained their country to the visiting American by saying, we're not like those other Latin American countries. We are democracy. We know how to govern ourselves. That was their expression. We know how to govern ourselves. My Chilean friends didn't foresee what was coming up in 6 years, but Chile was drifting into a breakdown of political compromise. Psst, Americans, what do you think about breakdown of political compromise? And in Chile, breakdown of political compromise led to a military coup in 1973. The Chileans expected the military government to stay in office just a couple of months and go back to democracy. But instead, the military government stayed in power for 17 years, smashed world records for sadism and torture.
How could the Chile scenario play out in the U.S.? You've said you don't expect a coup by our military, which hasn't been involved in our politics in America. So how might a threat of authoritarianism play out in the U.S.?
Authoritarianism might play out in the U.S. in the way that it's starting to play out now. There are other ways to end democracy than by a military coup. You can end democracy by progressively making it harder and harder for citizens to register to vote. Think about the United States. You can end a democracy by the government decreasing its investment in its citizens so that 10% of the citizens get a good education and job training and 90% don't. That means the effective undermining of a democracy even without a military coup. For example, in the state of either Alabama or Mississippi, to vote in Alabama or Mississippi, you have to show a driver's license. Well, plenty of African Americans don't have driver's licenses, and the state of Alabama, in its wisdom, decided, because the state is controlled by the party opposite to the party that African Americans are likely to vote. The state of Alabama decided to close down Department of Motor Vehicle offices in those counties with African American majorities, making it impossible for African Americans to get driver's licenses. Naturally, that provoked a lawsuit, so the state of Alabama backtracked. And yes, it opened DMV offices in those counties one day a month on Wednesday when people are working, all of which is an example of how a local or state government in the United States can make it difficult for citizens likely to choose the other vote. And that's one example, Alabama, but there are so many other ways that it happens by gerrymandering and by, for example, in the most recent election for governor of Georgia. Who do you imagine was the chief state electoral official for the government for the state of Georgia? It was the candidate for the governor of Georgia.